Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a very great privilege to introduce to you John Polkinghorne. Reverend Dr. John Polkinghorne is very well known indeed in science and religion circles, a pioneer. And he started life in mathematical physics, was professor here, then trained for ordination and did several parish jobs before returning to Cambridge as Dean of Trinity Hall and then President of Queen's College. He was awarded the KBE for his work in science and religion and his role on various national bodies. So he has written numerous books on science and religion, and we've got quite a selection which you'll be able to browse and buy at our bookstall when that opens up later in the morning. So John, it's a terrific privilege to have you with us and to start us off.
I'm a scientist and a Christian, more specifically I'm a physicist and a priest. And sometimes when people hear that, they give you a funny sort of look, a mixture of incredulity and suspicion, as if you said I'm a vegetarian butcher. Because a lot of people out there think that there's some sort of warfare going on between science and religion, and you really ought to decide which of the battle lines you're going to join. Now, of course, I don't believe that. I think that science and religion are friends and not foes. And the basic reason why they're friends is I think that both of them, in their different ways, are concerned with the search for truth. Truth attained through motivated belief. And it's very important to stress the motivation. I have a number of friends of the scientific world who aren't religious believers, but who are both wistful and wary about religion. They're wistful because they can see that science, wonderful though it is, doesn't answer every question you might want to ask. But they're wary because their picture of religion is it's based on faith, and their picture of faith is that you shut your eyes, you grit your teeth, leave 6 impossible things before breakfast, because some unquestionable authority says that's what you've got to do. And of course they don't want to commit intellectual suicide, neither do you, and neither do I. And I'm always trying to dissuade my friends in science. I have reasons for my religious beliefs, just as I have reasons for my scientific beliefs. Of course, they're different kinds of reasons, but they're both, because they're different kinds of beliefs, but they're both there. People sometimes say that science deals with fact, and religion just is opinion. In other words, science is really true, and religion might be true for you in the sense that it helps you a bit. It isn't really true in the sense of actually corresponding to the way things are. Now, when people say that, I think they're making 2 bad mistakes. First of all, they're making a mistake about science, actually. There are no interesting scientific facts that are not already interpretive facts. I can show you some colossal piece of apparatus and turn the switch and the pointer can move across the scale to 3.7 or something. You'd all agree that's happened. But that wouldn't be very interesting until you know what the machine is capable of measuring, what it's up to. And to do that, you need theoretical opinion. You need a theoretical explanation of what the machine is capable of measuring. So in science and in physics, experiment and theory interlace each other, interact with each other. Theory interprets experiments, and experiments, of course, constrain or confirm or disconfirm theory. So there's a sort of circular interaction between the two. So scientific facts are certainly taken seriously, but they're not indubitable facts in that pointer turning to 3.7%. Equally, I say, I believe I have motivations for my religious beliefs and try and share that with my friends. Some of my motivations for religious belief arise from taking science seriously, and that's one of the things we're going to try and explore a bit this morning. Now, science and religion are both seeking truth. Of course, they're seeking different kinds of truth, different levels of truth, and because they're asking different questions about the world. Putting it slightly crudely, but I think not misleadingly, science is essentially asking the question of how things happen. What's the process of the world by which things happen? And that's a very important question to ask, and science, of course, has been stunningly successful in finding answers to that question. It's not the only question to ask about what's going on. You also ask, if you like, the why question. Is there something going on in what's happening? Is there meaning and value and purpose present in the world? And that's the set of questions that science, just by its very nature, by its definition of itself, brackets out. It doesn't seek to address those questions. It concentrates simply on the how question of process. And of course, we all are perfectly familiar with the fact that you can ask and answer both questions both the how question, if you like, the why question of religion, about what's happening in the world. The kettle's boiling, because I want to make a cup of tea. That's an answer in terms of purpose. Kettle's boiling because the burning gas heats the water. That's an answer in terms of process. And if I'm to understand the mysterious event of the boiling kettle, I need to ask and answer both questions. I don't have to choose between the two. They're both true. Similarly, I think we can see these different levels of understanding science in the world, in that sort of way. They're not only asking different questions, they're also considering different levels of experience. Science essentially treats reality impersonally. It treats the world as an it, as an object, something you can kick around, pull apart, and find out what it's made of, in that sort of way, where you can repeat experiences as often as you like, until you're satisfied that you really see what's going on. And that gives science its great secret weapon, which is the weapon of experiment. I'm going to give you a glass of water, that would be very helpful. The secret weapon of experiment are putting things to the experimental test in that sort of way. If you don't believe what I tell you about some phenomenon, then in principle and sometimes even in practice, you can go and do it for yourself. And you can, as I say, do it over and over again. We all know there's a whole swathe of experience where we encounter reality not as an it, as an object in that sort of way, but as a thou, in personal terms. Thank you very much, that's very helpful. In personal terms. And when we enter that realm of personal experience, whether it's encounter between ourselves or encounter with the transpersonal reality of God, then testing has to give way to trusting. It's a different form of finding motivation and understanding. You have to respect the nature of what it is you're trying to understand. I've always set little traps to see if you're my friend. I will destroy the possibility of friendship between us, because that friendship can only be based on mutual respect and trust. And it's just a fact of the spiritual life. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. So there's another difference between science and religion. Personal experience is not repeatable. We never hear a Beethoven quartet exactly the same way twice, even if we play the same disc. There's that element of uniqueness in personal experience. But most of the experience that science is talking about is repeatable. And even those aspects of science consider unrepeatable phenomena, like, for example, cosmology. There's only one universe to study, only one universe's history to study. Nevertheless, the experimental sciences, physics and so on, are very important in our gaining understanding of what's going on. So there are these different levels of truth. There is the different questions that are being asked and the different forms of encounter with reality. And if we stop there, you might think that science and religion are so different from each other, they really wouldn't have very much interaction with each other. And there are quite a lot of people who think that. Particularly quite a lot of scientists who don't want to be disrespectful to religion, but equally don't want to take it too seriously. And so they see religion as one sort of realm, a realm perhaps of ethics, something like that, and science is dealing with a realm of facts, in that sort of unproblematic way, which is actually not the way it works. And they say, okay, no, that's quite strange for me. But that's not right. And how and why are different questions. But the manner in which I answer those two questions has to fit together, has to make sense, be consonant. I would say to you, I'm going to make a cup of tea, and I put the kettle in the refrigerator. You would suspect that there was something funny going on. So though science and religion don't answer each other's questions, I think we have every reason to believe that scientifically posable questions will receive scientifically stageable answers. They may be quite hard to find in certain circumstances, but I'm told that's the way to look for them. But equally, we have reason to believe that the theological questions will receive theological answers for exactly the same reason. But the two sets of answers have to be consonant with each other. They have to fit together. What science tells us about the physical world and about the history of life will certainly have an influence upon our understanding of the world as a divine creation. So that we look for consonance between the two, not a deduction from one to the other, not a taking over of one by the other, but a relationship by putting the two together, being binocular, if you like, looking with the eye of science on the world, looking with the eye of religion on the world, we'll see deeper and further than we could with either eye on its own. That means there is an interaction between the two. And I want to, that's what I really want to talk about in this introductory talk this morning. And part of that interaction is that there are certain questions that arise from our experience of doing science, but which are not scientific in their character. They are what, if you like, learned language, you might call meta-questions, questions that arise in one context, but take us beyond that context. They arise from our experience of doing science, but because they're not scientific in themselves, science itself will not be able to answer them, but nevertheless they're meaningful and seems to be necessary questions to address. And I want to give a couple of examples, well, one very briefly, because probably we'll talk about it much more this afternoon. But the particular question I want to talk about this morning is a question so simple that most of the time we don't even stop to think about it. And it's simply this: why is science possible at all in the deep-seated way that it's proved to be? Well, you might say evolutionary biology will explain that. If evolution hadn't shaped our brains in such a way that we're capable of understanding the world, then we wouldn't be able to survive it. So it's understanding the world is just an adaptive resource for survival. And of course that's true up to a point. If we couldn't figure out it's a bad idea to step off the top of a high cliff, we wouldn't stay around very long, rather longer in East Anglia than most parts of the world. We wouldn't stay around forever. That's one thing. But it's something quite different when somebody like Isaac Newton came along, and an astonishing creative leap of the human imagination saw that the same force that makes the high cliff dangerous is also the force that holds the moon in its orbit around the Earth in its orbit around the sun, and discover the mathematically beautiful law of universal inverse square law of gravity, in terms of that be able to explain the behavior of the whole solar system. Now that ability to understand the world deeply in that sort of way far exceeds anything that we need for everyday survival, or in my view anything that could be considered just a happy spin-off from the brain neural development needed for everyday survival. I'm rather fond of Sherlock Holmes, and you may remember that when Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson first meet, it's in the study of Scarlet, they're having a conversation, and Holmes, I think, is pulling Watson's leg from the start, and he says to him, I don't know, he says, I don't know, does the Earth go around the Sun, or does the Sun go around the Earth? And the good doctor, of course, is horrified at his apparent ignorance on the part of the great detective. And Holmes simply says to him, what does it matter? My daily work as a detective. And of course it doesn't matter at all for his daily work as a detective. But we all know many things that we don't need to know for everyday purposes, but which nevertheless enrich our lives and deepen our understanding. So why is science possible in that sort of way? I mean, I worked in quantum physics all my professional life in science. The quantum world is totally different from the world of every day. In the quantum world, if you know where something is, you don't know what it's doing. You know what it's doing, you don't know where it is. That's Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in a nutshell. That world is totally different from the world of every day, unpicturable to us, and it needs for us to understand the ideas which are quite different from the ideas of everyday experience. Nevertheless, we can understand it. So why is science possible? Why is this physical world so deeply transparent to our inquiry? And the fact of the matter is deeper than that still, because it turns out that the key to unlocking these secrets of the physical universe is mathematics. Good news for some, not such good news for others. It's actual technique in fundamental physics to look for theories which in their mathematical expression are endowed with the property of mathematical beauty. Now, some of you will know about mathematical beauty, possibly not all of you. It's a slightly austere form of aesthetic experience, but it's something that those of us who speak that language can both recognize and agree about. It involves qualities like economy and elegance, and something that the mathematicians call being deep, which means that you take a very simple-looking starting point, and it turns out to lead to very extensive and unexpected conclusions. A very example of that, if you know anything about it, is the Mandelbrot set. You've all seen pictures of the Mandelbrot set, these psychedelic pictures of this fantastically complex thing which is sort of made up of worlds and dragon's claws, made up of worlds and dragon's claws, down and down and down, endlessly proliferating structure. The definition of the man-of-war set you can write down in about 2 or 3 lines. But the consequence of that definition is this unlimited proliferation of remarkable structure. So mathematical beauty is something that people recognize. And it's an actual technique of discovery in theoretical physics to look for theories which have that characteristic. And that's not just aesthetic indulgence on the part of the physicist. Sometimes philosophers of science will suggest that, but it's not. It really does lead to discovery. I suppose the greatest theoretical physicist I've known personally is somebody called Paul Dirac. You may or may not recognize his name. He was one of the founding figures of quantum theory. He was Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Newton's Old Chair here in Cambridge for more than 30 years, and unquestionably the greatest British theoretical physicist of the 20th century. And he made his great discoveries by a relentless and highly successful lifetime quest for mathematical beauty. In fact, he once said it is more important to have beauty in your equations than to have them fit experiment. Now, of course, he didn't mean by that at the end of the day it didn't matter whether your equations fit the experiment. I mean, no scientist could think that. Empirical adequacy is something you've got to try and attain. What Dirac meant was this: okay, you've got this new theory, you've got these new equations, you had to go trying to solve them. They don't seem to fit the facts that the experimentalists are telling you. Of course, that's a setback, obviously. But it may not necessarily be totally fatal. First of all, almost certainly, you'll have had to solve the equations in some sort of approximation. And maybe you just made the wrong approximation. Or it's just possible the experiments are wrong. We've done that actually more than once in physics. So at least there's some sort of residual hope. It might all come out okay in the end. But Dirac suggests that if your equations are ugly, there's no hope. The whole 300-year history of modern theoretical physics testifies against the possibility of ugly equations actually turning out to describe the physical world. Dirac had a brother-in-law whose name was Eugene Wigner, who also actually won a Nobel Prize for Physics. And Wigner once said, "Why is mathematics so unreasonably effective?" You see, what's mathematics? Mathematics is an abstract subject. Our mathematical friends sit in their studies, out of their heads they dream up the beautiful patterns of pure mathematics. If mathematics isn't your subject, just think of it as being a pattern-creating, pattern-analyzing subject. What I'm saying to you is some of the most beautiful patterns that the mathematicians think of are found to actually occur, to be instantiated in the structure of the physical world around us. That's a very remarkable and strange thing. What links together the reason within, the thoughts of our minds, our mathematical thoughts in our minds, and the reason without, the orderly structure of the world around us? They seem disconnected from each other. Nevertheless, they have this intimate relationship with each other. So why is science possible? Why is mathematics so unreasonably effective? Well, it would, I think, be intolerably intellectually lazy just to shrug our shoulders and say, well, gee, that's the way it just happens to be, and a bit of good luck for you chaps who are good at maths. That would be really opting out of seeking understanding through and through. And the reason people do science is they want to understand the world as deeply and thoroughly as possible. So we should try and answer those questions. That's the meta question. You see, it arises from our experience of doing science, but it is not itself a scientific question. Scientists are very happy that that's the case. They're happy to exploit the possibilities that the rational transparency of the world gives to them. They're happy to have the experience of wonder when these beautiful equations are found to actually fit the structure of the world around us in that sort of way. And certainly wonder is a very important word in a scientist's vocabulary. Of course, they never use it when they write austere papers for the learned journals, but in conversation, it's a word that we use quite a lot. I mean, doing science actually is quite hard work. Like everything else worthwhile, it has its own degree of routine, wearisome routine. It also has its own frustrations, as the good ideas of the morning prove less attractive and persuasive in the cold light of the afternoon. So it's hard work, and that's what I'm saying. The reason we do it is that we want to understand the world, and the payoff for doing that is that occasional experience of wonder, or some new remarkable aspect of the world around us is revealed to our inquiry. So we should find a reason for the success of science in that profound kind of way. And when you ask a better question like that, you won't have a knockdown answer. I wouldn't suggest that that you'd be stupid if you didn't agree with me about this. But to me, the most persuasive answer to why science is possible, why mathematics is unreasonably effective, is provided for me by the understanding of the world as a divine creation. I mean, in its rational order of beauty, I've been describing a world that is shot through with signs of mind. And I think it is worth asking, and I'm sure you all do ask, whether it is the capital M mind of the Creator that lies behind that wonderful order. So I think science is possible. The reason within and the reason without fit together in this sort of way, precisely because the world is a divine creation. And to use an ancient and powerful phrase, we are creatures made in the image of our Creator. I actually think that the ability of science is a small part, no doubt, but a small part of the Imago Dei. It's certainly something that we should be grateful for. So that's an example of how I think science and religion relate to each other. Not answering each other's questions, but together providing a deeper intelligibility of the world. There's another meta question that actually Rodney will be talking about this afternoon, so I'll just mention it in passing. And that is, why is the universe so special? Now, scientists don't like things to be special. We like to talk about things in general. And our expectation would certainly have been that the universe is just a fairly typical common or garden example of what a universe might be like. But as Rodney will explain this afternoon, that's not the case at all. A universe that's capable of producing carbon-based life, of producing beings of the complexity of you and me, is a very, very special universe indeed. It's a very remarkable conclusion. And all scientists would accept that that's the case. I mean, there's no question that if the laws of nature had been a little bit different, we wouldn't be here to think about them. The argument, of course, begins about what significance you attribute to that, and Rodney will discuss various things. But one of them, obviously, would be that, again, that the world is a creation. The world is finely tuned for life, very specific for the possibility of carbon-based life, because it isn't any old world. It's a world whose creator wishes it, wills it to have a fruitful history. So those are a couple of examples of these meta questions, and they lie behind a revival which has taken place in our time of natural theology. Natural theology, of course, is the attempt to learn something about God from general experience, from the inspection of the world, and from rational argument, as opposed to through divine revelation in particular circumstances and particular events and people. Natural theology is a small part of the theological endeavour, but I think it's an important part of the theological endeavour. And it has a long history. In fact, if you in the Hebrew Scriptures, I think the wisdom writers are a good example of natural theologians. I mean, Israel never got anywhere near science. They didn't have the right sort of mindset to really get on to science. But the wisdom writers, as you know, the wisdom writers, they look at the world in a sort of cool, detached sort of way. They don't make much appeal to salvation history, but they look at the world and they see what's happening. They see the way of a snake on a rock, the way of a ship through the sea, the way of a man with a woman, and they ask the question, how do we understand this? And they see these as reflections, again, of the purpose of the Creator. So natural theology is has a very long history. In Christian thinking, it really had two periods of flourishing. One was the later Middle Ages, where people like Anselm and Aquinas, where very much the emphasis was on an appeal to reason. And entirely so, of course, in the ontological argument of Anselm, a brilliant argument, but I think a mistaken argument. Anselm tries to reduce the divine rabbit out of a logical top hat, and I think that's just not something you can do, and I think Kant showed how the trick was done. Existence is not a predicate in the sense that Anselm required it to be. But then Aquinas, of course, didn't accept the ontological argument anyway. But his 5 ways which are his expression of natural theology, are pretty general in their character. They look to the existence of change in the world, and therefore argue there must be an unchanging ground to ensure of reality to ensure the continuation of the world and so on. Only the fifth way, which is a sort of fairly muted argument to design, makes any particular appeal to the specificity of the world around. But of course, in the late 18th and early 19th century, with people like William Paley and the authors of the Bridgewater Treatises, and a little bit earlier, and those with John Ray, the wisdom of God manifested in the works of creation, his famous book, we see an uninhibited appeal, really, to an argument for design. Very persuasive it must have seemed, the marvelous adaptation of living beings to functional effectiveness in their environments. But as we all know, of course, the rug was drawn from beneath that argument by Charles Darwin, who showed in 1859, the publication of The Origin of Species, how the accumulation of so few small differences over very long periods of time could lead to the appearance of design without the direct intervention of some capital D designer. And when that happened, I think a lot of people lost their nerve about natural theology. And then Karl Barth came along, of course, in the first half of the 20th century, and said, absolute nine to natural theology, and it sort of fell out of favour. And I think a lot of theologians are still pretty sort of wary about it, but it had had a considerable revival in that time. Not so much at the hands of the theologians, actually, interestingly, as at the hands of the scientists. Not just pious scientists like me, people like me, but also somebody like Paul Davies, some of you will know his writing, I expect, God and the New Physics and The Mind of God, who actually doesn't subscribe to any religious tradition, but nevertheless feels that the character of the world is such that there is more to be said about it than science can express, and there is, again, some sort of mind, capital M mind, behind the world. So natural theology has revived in that way, but it's also in a revised form. The old natural theology, particularly the natural theology of people like Paley and so on, made an unfortunate mistake. They were taking a phenomenon, which is a scientific phenomenon, the development of the mammalian eye, for example, and saying that they would propose a theological answer to it. Now, I've already said that I believe that scientific questions will receive scientifically stateable answers. Science, in that sense, does not need augmentation from theology. And Darwin's insights, of course, provide an outstanding example of that. So they were really, I think, barking up the wrong tree. They're not the right place. But when we talk about meta-questions, when we talk about questions that arise from science but are not intrinsically scientific questions, then we are seeking intelligibility, which science itself cannot provide. And I think that a theological understanding of the world will provide very comprehensive and persuasive understanding of that. So that's one example of the interaction between science and theology. If they're both seeking truth, they will have gifts to give to each other. I'm suggesting that these theology's answer to these meta-questions is a gift of the science. It takes absolutely seriously science's achievement and intelligibility, but sets it in a broader and deeper context of understanding. And that I think is an important thing to do. But also science has gifts to give to theology, and its basic gift it has to give to theology is to tell theologians and religious believers generally what the world is like that we live in. What is its character? The character of the physical world, and also the character of the biological world, the story of life. And those are gifts that religious people should take very seriously and receive with gratitude. It grieves me when I sometimes see, rather more in North America, of course, than in this country, when I see people who I'm sure are genuinely wishing to serve the God of truth, but who refuse scientific truth when it's offered to them. Of course, not all truth comes from science, and we've made that point several times over this morning, but some of it does, and we should take that seriously. And one of the most important insights that's come from science has been that we live in a world which is not a ready-made world, a world which has a long history, very long history, which has looked very different in the past, in which what we see now can only be understood, at least partially in terms of its origin in the past, a world, in fact, which is evolving in that sort of sense. Now, Dennis will be talking after coffee about evolution. Let me just make if I may, from a physicist's point of view, just make a couple of comments about that. First is that evolutionary process is more widespread than simply biological evolution, important though that story is. The essential nature of evolutionary process is an interaction between two, you might say, opposing tendencies in the world, which in a slogan sort of way we can label as chance and necessity. Now those are sort of slippery words. Chance doesn't mean the capricious acts of the goddess Fortuna. It means contingency, that this happens rather than that. And I mean, the possibilities are so vast that only a small fraction of possible events can actually occur within cosmic history. If we look at the biological example for a minute, this particular genetic mutation takes place and moves the stream of life in some particular direction. A different mutation might have taken place and moved in a slightly different direction. We might have been six-fingered rather than five-fingered as the Homo sapiens. So there's contingency present as well. But just contingency on its own would be just sort of chaos, really. And we also have a lawful necessity, which is the interaction between those two, between contingency and lawfulness, between chance and necessity, which is the source of fruitful development in the history of the world in which we live. Scientists like to say regimes in which truly novel things happen are located at the edge of chaos. In other words, exactly in this regime where chance and necessity fairly even-handedly interlace with each other. If things are too chancy, too contingent, then you simply have haphazardness. Any new thing that might come into existence will not be able to persist. It will appear and then disappear. If things are too regular, then they will be too rigid for anything really new to happen. You might have rearrangements, but you won't have something really novel happening. You need just this delicate balance between chance and necessity to bring things into new things into operation. So I say that it can be illustrated in the whole history that we know of the world in which we live. Just take one example from physical cosmology, not to try and rashly to try and trespass on biological grounds in this respect. The very early universe, which started, as you all know, 13.7 billion years ago, started extremely simple. The very early universe is an almost uniform expanding ball of energy, which is just about as simple a physical system as you can think about. That's one of the reasons why cosmologists can speak, in my view, with justified confidence about the very early universe in many of its aspects. Now that world that started so simple has now become, of course, rich and complicated, with you and me actually the most complicated consequences of its evolving history that we're aware of. The human brain is far and away the most complex physical system we've encountered anywhere in our exploration of the universe. I say it started almost uniform. If it had been totally uniform, it would have stayed that way for the whole of its history. But there were just little variations, little ripples in the apparent uniformity, at the level of about one part in 100,000. Just little fluctuations in the density of matter energy in the very early universe. Now those little fluctuations, tiny and insignificant as they might seem, at the level of 1 in 100,000, are the seeds from which all future fruitfulness was going to grow. Places where there was a little bit more matter than elsewhere exerted a little bit stronger gravitational pull, which drew in more matter. So gradually, over a period of about 1 billion years, the universe became lumpy and grainy with stars and galaxies. There had been no fluctuations, there would have been no stars and galaxies. There would have been no stars and galaxies, there would be no life. Not least because the stars are where the elements essential for life, like carbon, are actually made in the interior nuclear furnaces of the stars. Every atom of carbon in your body was once inside a star. So that's an interplay, essential development of graininess in the universe. There's an interplay between chance and necessity. Chance is those little fluctuations. Necessity is a lawful, regular law of gravity, which enhances those irregularities to produce eventually the structure of stars and galaxies, so essential for future history. So evolutionary process in that sense is is an absolutely universal feature of the development of the world. Of course, there's no analogue for natural selection in that, my particular cosmic example. But the essence of the evolution process is it's taking place at the edge of chaos in this sort of sense. Now, if things are going to take place at the edge of chaos, there will be great fruitfulness, but obviously there will also be ragged edges and blind alleys. So we begin to see that this way of understanding physical process may begin to give, in fact I believe does begin to give, theology some help as it wrestles with perhaps one of its most profound problems, which is the existence of natural evil in the world, disease and disaster. We tend to think if we'd been in charge of the world, we would have creation, we would have done it better. We would have got all the nice things, sunsets and the flowers, got rid of all the nasty things, the disease and disaster. The more science helps us to understand how the world works, the more we see these things are intrinsically entangled with each other. You can't tear them apart. Here are the good things, we keep those, here are the bad things, throw them away. You have to have this element of chaos as well as the element of order. If I may, for a moment, steal an illustration from biology. If there were no genetic mutation, there would be no new forms of life. If there was genetic mutation the whole time, there would be no established species which could be sifted and preserved by natural selection. We need this balance between the two. So I think that science helps theology to see that a sort of naively paradisal world is not in fact a coherent possibility. There is always a shadow side to fruitful process. I find that mildly helpful. You know, when Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, there's a sort of popular myth circulated by people who ought to know better, that when it was published, all the scientists said yes, 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 and all the religious people said no, 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 and that's the parting of the ways. In fact, there was a diverse reaction in both camps. There were scientists who had trouble with Darwin's ideas, Richard Owen, the greatest comparative naturalist, and they never believed in evolution. Partly, I think, from professional jealousy, but that's another matter. And the religious people who welcomed it from the start, one of whom was Charles Kingsley, the novelist and clergyman, who coined a phrase that I think is the theological, it encapsulates the theological way to think about evolution. He said, no doubt God could have snapped the divine fingers, brought into being a ready-made world, but God had done something clever than that, or had made it clear that God had done something clever than that. He had brought into being a world so endowed with potentiality, with fruitfulness, that creatures could be allowed, within reason of course, could be allowed to make themselves. That's the way to think about an evolving creation. It's a creation in which creatures are making themselves in that sort of way. And I think that world is a greater good than a ready-made world would be. It is, if I may be bold enough to say so, more fitting creation for the God of love than a ready-made world would have been. The God of love can't be just a cosmic tyrant. His creation is a sort of divine puppet theatre in which God pulls every string. There must be some gift of freedom for creatures to be themselves and to make themselves. But that gift has this shadow, inescapable shadow tied to it. And I find that helpful in wrestling with the problems of evil and suffering in the world. There's one final thing I think I want to say. It's about intellectual stance in a way that's encouraged by science. If science teaches you anything, it is that the world is surprising, beyond our powers to anticipate. I've already mentioned briefly quantum physics. The quantum world is very, very strange, quite different from the world of everyday experience. That's why it requires a lot of struggle to understand what's going on. It's a world in which you can have entities like light, sometimes behaving like waves, sometimes behaving like particles. Now, that seems absolute common sense thinking. That seems absolutely ridiculous. I mean, a wave is spread out and flappy, and a particle is a little bullet. So how can something sometimes look like spread out and flappy, sometimes look like a little bullet? Nevertheless, that's how light's been found to behave. Essentially, wave nature of light was discovered in the 19th century. Beginning of the 20th century, the particle aspect of it became apparent. And it took about 25 years for physicists to find out how that was a possibility, how that was a possibility. And for about 25 years, they had to live with an apparent paradox. I mean, nobody could understand how you could have wave-particle duality. But that was the way it was, and you just had to hold on by the skin of your intellectual teeth to what nature had revealed to you. Famous biologist J.B.S. Haldane in the late 1920s, commenting on the discoveries of his physicist colleagues, said that he thought the universe had turned out not only to be queerer than we thought, but queerer than we could have thought. It was only the nudge of nature, only the stubborn fact of wave-particle duality that eventually forced physicists to make sense of it by the discovery of quantum theory. And quantum theory is counterintuitive in terms of everyday expectation. The logic of the everyday, the logic of Aristotle, the logic of the man on the top of the Clapham omnibus, is based on the law of the excluded middle. There's A, or there's not A. And it's either one thing or the other. The billiard ball either is here, or it's somewhere else. That seems fairly obvious to us, and that's the basis of classical logic. In the quantum world, that logic doesn't hold. A different kind of logic. We're talking about an electron. Electron could be a mixture of being here and being there. There's a sort of middle term, undreamt of by Aristotle, between being here and being there. Namely, a bit of here and a bit of there. and that means that the logic of the quantum world, there is a special kind of quantum logic which has been explored and understood, and it is quite different from the world of every day. So common sense is not the measure of everything. And the general intellectual lesson I would draw for science is to say that you have to submit your thinking to the and allow it to be shaped by the way things are, because they may turn out to be clearer, not only than you thought, and you could have thought. That means, I think, that the instinctive question for a scientist to ask about something, whether it's within science or whether it's outside of science, is not, is it reasonable? As if we felt we knew beforehand the shape the reason had to take. We have to conform our thinking. The rational thing is to conform our thinking to the nature of what we're trying to think about. And that nature may be not what we have a priori expected it to be. So the actual question to scientists was, is it reasonable? But a different question, but once more open and also more demanding, saying, what makes you think that might be the case? In other words, there's no prior condition for what an acceptable answer is going to be. But if you're going to suggest to me a strange, queer, peculiar, unexpected answer, you would have to produce motivating evidence for it. I like to call that sort of thinking bottom-up thinking. It's thinking that tries to move from experience, the way we encounter reality, to understanding, as opposed to top-down thinking, which is the sort of style of the Grand Enlightenment project. I mean, a heroic project, but one that in the end didn't work, which says start on the 10th floor with clear and certain ideas, and then condescend to descend to particulars. And therefore, the science is a bottom-up thinker, start in the basement of experience, move from that to seek understanding. And I want to approach my search for truth in exactly that bottom-up fashion, including, of course, my theological thinking about things. When I gave my Gifford lectures, have the subtitle Theological Reflections of a Bottom-up Thinker, and they're an attempt to approach actually causes of Nicene Creed, in other words, pretty central orthodox traditional claims of Christian thinking, and to explain what makes me think those things might be the case. At the heart of Christianity, of course, lies a duality deeper even than wave-particle duality, the duality of humanity and divinity in Jesus Christ, and that's even harder to understand the wave-particle duality. But as I read the New Testament, as I read the early fathers of the Church, it seems to me that understanding of the human and divine in Christ didn't arise out of rash, ungrounded metaphysical speculation, but because, and you see this very clear in the pretty well all the writers of the New Testament, as they struggle to express their experience of the risen Christ, they found they're driven to use divine-sounding language about Jesus despite the fact they know he was somebody who was living within living memory. So that, for example, Paul starts his epistles usually by saying, "Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ," which is really a very strange thing to say. You know, Jesus is being bracketed with God. Strange thing for a monotheistic Jew to say. And it's being given the title of Lord, which in this context, I think, inevitably raises in one's mind the fact that Lord is in the Hebrew scriptures, is the title of God himself. And so I see, back where I started really think, that I believe my Christian beliefs are motivated beliefs, strange though they are in various ways. Well, I've talked for a bit now, so we can have a bit of a conversation, so over to you.
Well, that's a brilliant overview, and we do have a bit of time for questions, so over to you.
And comments, I would say.
And comments, yes.
Hi, I'm an Ordinand. Whilst this is not my belief, many people that I've probably come across may ask this kind of a question. You pose that science asks one type of question, but religion asks the questions about meaning and value.
All right.
But in today's world, it would possibly be culture and art and philosophy that would be turned towards to answer those questions of meaning and culture rather than religion. Could you comment on that?
Yes, of course. No, of course. Yes, I mean, in 50 minutes you can't say everything. So I was trying to. I think there's a whole spectrum of rational inquiry into reality, where one end is science, which is the easy end really, at the other end is theology, and in between there are there are all the things that are investigated by humane encounter with reality, the insights of ethics and of aesthetics, and so on. And I'm in the more adequate account, one would obviously take that into account too. And of course we know, it's obvious of course, that the cultural background at the very least influences the way in which we express things. That's true in science and it's true in theology. You've only got to think of the influence of Neoplatonism on Augustine or Aristotelianism on Aquinas to see that. And you have to be open to that. That makes the search for truth and understanding complex and subject to continual questioning and revision, I think. I wouldn't any sense deny that. And one of the things I'm battling against is the sort of fundamentalisms which locate total understanding at one end or other of the spectrum. Either the fundamentalism of creationism or something like that, or the fundamentalism of people like Dawkins. I mean, Dawkins doesn't begin to take seriously. I mean, I understand that he may not be persuaded by theological arguments, but pretend they don't exist is, in my view, just dishonest. And a lot of my scientific friends see that. In fact, quite a lot of my scientific friends who are not believers are fed up with Richard because they think that his opinionated way of talking gives science a bad name.
Thank you.
But thanks for making that point.
Yes.
Can I ask everybody to ball it out a bit?
Yeah.
I'm a bit deaf, so
Yeah, shout it out. Yeah, go on.
Please stand up. Please stand up.
You mentioned earlier that, in discussions that the existence of natural evil, about that good was kind of intrinsically tangled with evil, as it were. In heaven, do you believe that there will be evil, or will it just be good? And does that mean that there will be this kind of stasis rather than any kind of development?
That's a very good question, and thanks for asking. Yes, I mean, we're presented, say, at the end of Revelation with this picture of a world in which there's neither death nor mourning nor tears or crying anymore. The former things have passed away. Okay, if the new creation is going to be so wonderful and different, why do you bother with the old creation? I mean, this is a serious question. And I think the answer to that lies in recognizing, it seems to me, that God's creative purposes are in fact intrinsically two-stage.
I believe that God, first of all, brings into being a creation that exists at some distance from its creator, so that it will really be able to be itself and to make itself, not be overwhelmed. Finite beings will not be overwhelmed by the naked and unveiled infinite presence of their creator. So this world exists at some distance from its creator, and that's why it is a world in which creatures are making themselves and involves this thing. Now, I think the world to come is going to be different. It's going to be it's a world of resurrection, so it's going to be a world in which people are embodied, for example, but not in the matter of this world, but in some new form of matter. And I think it's, in a general sort of way, it's perfectly possible scientifically to envisage that God could bring into being a form of matter so strongly endowed with self-organizing principles that it's not subject to the thermodynamic drift to decay, which really produces death and futility in this world. I mean, obviously I don't know how to work that out in detail, but it doesn't seem to me inconceivable. But I think the point is that you get to that world through embracing God's offer, freely embracing. God's purpose is not to bring into being a creation that exists all the time, separate from its creator, but which creatures will freely embrace the offer of acceptance given them by their creator. This is a world that contains sacraments, particular covenanted occasions of which the veil across the divine presence is to some extent sin. The world to come will be suffused with the presence of the world of God, and will be totally sacramental in that sense. And I think that one can make sense in that sort of way. But it is a very good question, and we have, all the time. And it seems to me, on the one hand, Christian thinking, wrestling with evil and suffering, cannot do without eschatological hope. But it has to tackle that not in a sort of facile pie in the sky sort of way.
Thank you.
Thank you. And John has written a couple of books on eschatology too, written or edited, so which are a great help in that area. So.
Yeah.
You've talked about the debate between science and religion. I wondered if you would be able to say something about the debate, which I think is a more real debate, between pseudoscience and pseudo-religion, which I think is where the sort of public debate stands. And we as sort of trainee Christian ministers are going to be entering that debate much more than the academic science and religion.
Well, I would interpret what you've said. I would interpret the qualifier pseudo in the sense of representing a sort of total takeover bid. It's the sort of fundamentalist thing. That my understanding, whether it's science, whether it's religion, explains everything and doesn't need any help or insight from any other thing. That I think is just false and mistaken, and we have to combat that. And it's very important, I think, that it's very important, I think, that religious people recognize that they walk by faith and not by sight. That we're not given unrevisable certainty about things. I mean, we can bet our lives on things, but not in the sense that we are total possession of everything. You know, one of my favourite philosophers of science is Michael Polanyi, who was a very distinguished physical chemist before he turned to philosophy. He wrote a famous book called Personal Knowledge, and in the preface of that book he says, I'm writing this book to show how, he's talking about science, remember, I'm writing this book to show how I may commit myself to what I believe to be true, knowing that it might be false. And I think that's the human condition. Say we walk by faith and not by sight. We have sufficient motivation to commitment's a very important word for learning. We have enough motivation to commit ourselves to things, but we don't have unrevisable certainty about everything.
Thank you. Yeah, more questions? Yes.
I just wondered if you could tell us where and why the division between science and religion came about, because in the past, then often vicars were scientists and explorers of the natural world. So why this sudden separation?
Well, it's a complicated story. I think that I mean, there are people, for example, it's an argument we're thinking about, who suggest that modern science came into existence in say, the 17th century in Western Europe, partly through the influence of the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation, which said, A, God is a rational being, so there is an order to the world, but God is free and chooses the order that God is going to bring into being in creation. The Greeks thought, of course, that the demiurge had to follow the pattern of the world of ideas and didn't have any choice about it. So if you thought about it clear enough, you can figure out what the demiurge had to be. The Judeo-Christian understanding meant you had to look and see what God had actually done. And if the world is God's creation, it's also worth investigating, which I think the Chinese, who were so clever in many ways, probably didn't really take nature sufficiently seriously. And moreover, if it's not divine, you can put it around and investigate it without impiety. So there's an argument which says that the religious understanding of that kind was helpful in providing a cultural setting encouraging for the development of modern science in 17th century Western Europe. And the story since then is complicated. I mean, so there have always been scientists who are deeply religious people. One of the best books about that is John Hedley Book's historical book called Science and Religion, which portrays and which makes the point that his essential thesis is that there is no single rubric under which to understand these, neither conflict nor friendship, but very changing sorts of things. Well, you take the 19th century. You have people like Thomas Henry Huxley on the biological side who are resistant to religion, shall we say. But then all the great scientists of the 19th century, Faraday, Maxwell, Kelvin, and so on, were in fact very devout Christian believers. So it's always been a complicated scene. I think one has to recognise that. And I certainly don't think there is a single parting of the way. I mean, Galileo and then Darwin have been blown up as the sort of iconic events where things really parted. But I think a careful and sober evaluation shows that it's more complicated than that. I mean, Galileo certainly had his trouble with the church, and the church certainly made some mistakes, but Galileo was undoubtedly a religious believer.
I think I'm probably right in saying that one of Huxley's motivations was to sort of undermine the influence and prestige of the church, and also to professionalise science.
Yeah, that's commonly said. John Henry Book would agree with that. That's right. Of course, the word scientist is a 19th century word. It didn't exist before that. Natural philosopher was the word before that. And there was a sort of professionalisation of science that began in the 19th century. And I think there was a clear motivation. And so much work had been done by these country clergymen, you know, Gilbert Waits and people who were that kind of time to come to the chaps, amateurs to stand aside and let the professionals get to work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just following on from the other two questions with regards to the pseudoscience, pseudo-religion clash and why this came about, do you think it could possibly be because the public misunderstand the nature of science in terms of actually a true scientist doesn't hold up that he's got all the answers, but that he questions everything? So the problem that scientists should really have is not that their answer is right and religion's answer is wrong, but actually we don't know anything as scientists, yet people of faith say that they know that, you know, they know certain precepts like the Nicene Creed about their God. So do you think it's a misunderstanding on the nature of the public that they don't really understand what the whole raison d'etre of science is about, really?
Well, I think there are a lot of misunderstandings, and as we have opportunity and to do it honestly and in a measured way, we should try and help people see these things. I don't think it's true to say that scientists question everything. In fact, you know, sometimes people say scientists doubt everything. That would be an absolutely disastrous policy to follow. You would be paralysed by doubt. Scientists commit themselves to what they believe to be true, knowing that it might be false, and of course are open to revision. And as I say, there is a physiistic kind of religion, and there is a perception, a distorted perception of fideistic religion, which thinks that religious people are not open to change their views. I mean, the rate of change in theological thinking is obviously slower than in science, fairly obviously, but it does change. I mean, nobody could question, I think, that 21st century theologians think about the doctrine of creation, for example. ways that are different from predecessors of several centuries before her. Simply because I mean, a very important concept in current writing about creation is that not only of creation out of nothing, and of course holding the world of being, but continuous creation, the unfolding fruitfulness of the world. That's a thought that wouldn't have come naturally to anyone who believed that there was that the world in the past was very much the same as the world is today. So there is interaction.
Thank you. Yeah.
When you were talking about evolution, you described it as creatures creating themselves by divine intent. I just wondered, 'cause that comes across a little bit as deistic, and so I wondered if you could say something about how you understand God's interaction in human existence, and particularly probably something like the miraculous, how scientists would understand the concept of a miracle.
Well, those are very fair points to make. I can only give the sketches, the responses, obviously, in the time we have available. Yes, almost all of natural theology is as consistent with deism as it is with theism. But I, of course, believe in a God who interacts with the world. I believe in God's providential action in the world. And in fact, in the 1990s, that was the absorbing question in the science and theology community. I think what is clear, I think, is that science has not established the causal closure of the world on its own terms, and therefore, science, we can take science absolutely seriously, and not feel that we are driven either to deny our human powers of agency, of intentional action, or indeed God's providential action. So that will be a problem of miracle. Is the problem of divine consistency. God is not he's not condemned never to do anything new, but it is theologically inconceivable that God is a sort of show-off conjurer who does a trick today that God didn't do yesterday and won't do tomorrow. So that's the problem of consistency. And from that point of view, I think the easiest miracle to believe in is the resurrection, because frankly you can see the point of it. But, water into wine, there are different views on that. Yeah, we're just trying to get in for a yes.
As an Ordinand at Westcott House, we engage in something called experimental worship on a regular basis. I wonder if you think you can apply scientific principles to worship.
Well, I don't think so in any very extensive way, any more than I think you can apply scientific principles simply to, say, aesthetic appreciation. I mean, you can do a sort of acoustic analysis of a great musical work, but there's more to it than that. You can do a chemical analysis of a great picture, but there's more to it than that. I think that the experience of worship is extremely important. I mean, I think that I sometimes, talking about the strangeness of the physical world, talking about universe-assisted logic, and talking about it religiously, I sometimes want to talk about liturgically enabled logic. So I think the experience of worship is very but because it's personal, because it's not repeatable under controlled conditions, I mean, as any personal experience is, it's a form of evidence that is indispensable in my view, but requires obviously sensitive handling.
Maybe it shouldn't be called experimental in that sense.
Experiential would be the word.
No, experimental.
Yeah, no. Experiential would be the word that I would myself prefer.
I mean, one of the things that will come, or you'll hear about on Friday, is our Test of Faith project, which John was involved with. But what more recent development of that is developing creation liturgies and that sort of thing. So that might be something to explore.
Yeah, I think creation is very short-changed in the church's worship. Actually, I mean, there's no big festival of creation. I mean, it pops up occasionally, but
that was something that was mooted in the Society of Ordained Scientists.
Yes,
yeah. Back and, as a possibility. Yeah. Any more questions? Yes.
You mentioned when you were talking about quantum physics, which I just don't pretend to understand. I tried to read your little booklet for the Observer, and I suppose it's because I'm not a mathematician. Anyway, but you talk about new logic,
right?
Right?
Right.
Now, talking, the question that our friend had about what heaven might be like,
Right.
would it be useful for us to think of heaven being new logic? You know, we're so tied, as you say, Aristotelian logic and so on. Is it conceivable that another world will have, like quantum physics, of things that we just can't get our minds around now?
Well, yes, I think that's entirely possible. I mean, I think the nature of rationality is to try to conform one's thinking to the character of what one's trying to think about. And the character of new creation is obviously different in all sorts of ways from the character of the present creation. And that could imply some different form of logic. We have to be very careful. Again, we do change our modes of thinking to try and do so in ways that are motivated by the reality we're trying to think about. And of course it's difficult to think about the life of the world to come. And wait and see is the answer to a good many eschatological queries of that sort. I mean, it seems to me that Christian eschatological hope inevitably has a fairly large speculative aspect to it. It rests on two firm foundations. One is the faithfulness of God, which is Jesus' argument with the Sadducees, of course. And the other, of course, is the resurrection.
Thank you. And there was one there. Yeah.
Yes, just a question. At one point, you talked about there being no room for a kind of naively paradisial world because of the way you see death and so on, mutation being part of the way things have to be. Yeah. I wonder if you just expand on that and talk about your doctrine of the fall, and whether you think just as there was there will be a perfect end, there was a perfect beginning.
Well, I think we have absolutely no reason to suppose that the world started in some sort of unproblematic paradisal way. I mean, clearly death has been in the world far, far longer than there have been hominids in the world. I mean, in fact, our genetic ancestors, the little furry mammals of 65 million years ago, got their chance when the dinosaurs were extinguished by, presumably, very likely an asteroid impact. So I mean, the big answer to the natural evil that was so popular among the fathers, namely that the whole world fell with Adam, is, I think, just not accessible to us. So what's the fall? Well, I think the way I see it is this. I think that human beings, of course we have a lot of things in common with the animals, but I think we have some respects by which we differ from them. One of them is that we possess what I would like to call self-consciousness. That's to say, the animals, of course, higher animals clearly are conscious, but they live, I think, in the near present. The chimpanzee can throw up the stick, maybe the banana falls down. The chimpanzee doesn't project his thought far into the future and say, in 15 years, 20 years, I'm going to be dead. We do. We have that. That's what I mean by self-consciousness. And I think at the same time that self-consciousness, somewhere along the line of hominid development, self-consciousness came into being. We don't know where, and it's very difficult to imagine how it happened. It was clearly, I think, a process. It wasn't that somebody woke up one day and said, gee, I can use the future tense. It must have been some sort of process. I think at the same time that our ancestors became self-conscious in that way, they also became God-conscious in a new way. The animals are aware of the presence of their Creator. And again, as a process, somehow or other, our ancestors turned away from the pole of God into the pole of the self. And that was the fall. Not a single disastrous ancestral event, but a process of which we are all the heirs. I mean, the essence of sin is the refusal to accept that we are creatures. That's the temptation. The serpent whispers in Eve's ear, that powerful myth. Eat this apple and you'll be like God. You won't be God and you can't do it yourself. And so that's I think is the fall. That introduced a slantedness into human life, which is only too apparent. You know, I'm sure you all know that Reinhold Niebuhr once said that the only empirically observable Christian doctrine was original sin. Look around, look in your heart, and you'll see that something's gone wrong with humanity. So that's how I think about the fall in this sort of way.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one last one. Yes, you have a second one.
You've talked about science and religion in general.
Right.
And I wondered if you would say anything about which religions maybe can be part of this debate, which I think is very clearly, there is a relationship between Christianity and science, as you've been talking about. And I wondered if you would...
Yes, well, I think that one of the big differences between science and religion is that in science the dust does settle. I mean, I worked in physics during the 25 years in which we discovered the quark structure of matter. And there was a lot of argument along the way, and a lot of uncertainty and difficulty along the way, but in the end, the dust settled, and we all agree the world is made of quarks. In religion, there is a persisting disagreement. The world's faith traditions are all, I think, recognisably talking about the same realm of experience, some sort of encounter with sacred reality over and against us, made in some sort of way, but they have such very different things to say about it. It's very perplexing. And I don't think it's just cultural differences. I mean, there are very, and it's not just a question of core beliefs either. It's just not a question of divinity of Christ and authority of the Quran. There are just metaphysical differences. I mean, what is the human person? The Abrahamic faiths say the human person is of abiding significance. Our Hindu friends say that the human self is recycled through reincarnation. Our Buddhist friends say that the human self is an illusion from which to seek release. Those aren't three groups of people saying the same thing in culturally different languages. They're three groups of people radically disagreeing with each other. And I think the second most perplexing problem of theology today, after the problem of evil and suffering, is the problem of how to understand how the world's faiths relate to each other. I think it's going to be a long and painful dialogue between the two. I think we can no longer think that we know everything and they know nothing. We can see the authenticity of their spiritual lives. Legally, we're not all saying the same thing. And I think it'll take a millennium rather than a century to really make progress in that dialogue.
Thank you. Well, I think we ought to draw to a close there. John's given us a terrific start to our few days, and so let's give him a very big